Hi, today we will see dependency injection topic. Sometimes it's also called dependency inversion. It's a principle of a software development where a module should be loosely coupled, and if there is a dependency on a different modules, it should be easy to configure. We will also try to mimic Angular's at injectable decorator. If you have worked with Angular, you must be familiar with this syntax where you have a service and you put a decorator called injectable, and in the component we just try to inject it as a parameter into constructor. We will try to implement our own injectable decorator and our own dependency container, not exactly like Angular but a simplified version, just to explain the problem statement and how to solve this one. So let's get started. What is dependency injection? Let's say we have a class called HttpClient, and this class has the responsibility to fetch data over the internet. So all the network activity will be monitored and taken over by this class. Next, we have two classes. Let's say UserService and a TodoService. UserService is responsible for CRUD operation of users and Todo for Todo. And both of the services will use HTTP client class to make network API calls. Next, we have the user component. In user component, we expect a user to have an UI where user can interact with it, and it will pass on the request to the user service to do the CRUD operation. Same for the to do component. So let's see what is the issue now with this setup. We will try to create the initial setup here, and then we will slowly go to the solution. Okay, let me go to my blank one and let's get started. So initially I will create a class for HTTP client and user service, and I will and to do service, and we will see their dependency on each other. So let's define a class called HTTP client, and let's put a public method called get, which will accept an URL, and let's say it's returning any for now, and I will just return empty string. Here is my simple version of HTTP client class. Next, I have a user service class, and in this class, I will have a method called public get users, and let me return any for now. And I want to call get API from the HTTP client. So what I need to do is I need to have a member variable here for HTTP client, and I will initialize it to its new instance so that I can do something like this: return this dot HTTP client dot get, and in the URL I will pass users. Okay, and let me pass here like HTTP result returned here. Now let me create a variable here. Let's say user service is equal to new user service. Let me log it, console.log user service.get users, and I expect to see an output of a string that HTTP result is called. Okay, simple. So this is the dependency. We can see here user service class creates an instance of HTTP class. So this is the dependency we just implemented. Let's have similar for the to do class. So let me define another class to do service private read only HTTP client is equal to new HTTP client, and public get to do's. Let me return any for now. Return this dot HTTP client dot get and to do's. And if I create an instance of that, TodoService is equal to new TodoService. I think I use S here. And console.log TodoService dot get todos, and I should get output twice. Okay, so we have an output here. So we have the first section here implemented. Next, we need to have user component and todo component, which will have instance of user service. So let's define those classes now. Class user component, it will have instance of user service, new user service, and here I will have public get users, and it won't return anything for now, so I will just try to console out console.log this dot user service dot get users and class todo component. So this is private read only todo service is equal to new todo service, and I will have public get todos, won't return anything, console.log this dot todo service dot get todos. Now instead of creating instances of services, what I will do is I will create component. So first user component is equal to new user component and user component dot get users. Then let todo component is equal to new todo component and todo component dot get todos. So what did we change? We removed the console log and object creation for services, and we are creating the component classes here. Let me clear the result and run it again, and we should have the same output. Here is the dependency explained here. So we have a HttpClient class whose object is created into user service, and user service class object is created into user component. So user component, it owns the user service. User service is on HttpClient. So this is the dependency here. So this is the problem. So what is the problem here? Do you see? Let's say this HTTP client is being used or provided by a different library. In Angular case, it comes with a different package that you can import into application. Now, let's say you deploy your application for user component and to-do component, and there is a revision into the this HTTP client class. Let's say its component now expect a variable called retry count, and this is the new version available for HTTP client. So what happened now? This retry count is a must variable to be passed whenever you create a HTTP client. That means our constructor of user service and the to-do service, they both needs to be updated. Otherwise, you cannot create an instance of HTTP client. So this is a tight coupling. This is a dependency. Anytime the change happen in HTTP client constructor, you need to update your user service and to-do service. And same goes for the user service class. Like if there is another parameter added here, let's say filter, and here is a string, somehow some random parameter here. So what will happen? Now user component will also get an error because user component is trying to create a new instance of user service, right? So this is the dependency. And this dependency can be resolved with the different ways. And one of the ways is the dependency injection. Before doing that, Let's revise our application to return actual data. Here we are just returning a string. Let's make it a little bit better. So let me create some interface. Let's say user with ID, number, and name as string. And let me add some mock data. Constant mock users of type user array, and I will just add some mock objects here. ID1, name user1. Let me copy paste it 3 times, and let me just put it 2 here and 3. Same, I will create interface for to do ID number, then title say string, and is done boolean flag. Again, constant mock to-dos is equal of type to-do array, and it's an array of an object. So ID 1, then title task 1, and is done, let's say false. And let me copy this again, 1, 2, comma, and here is 2, is 3, let's say this 2, and we have mock users and mock to-dos. Now, what do you want to do? We were returning this empty, just a simple array here, right? What we want to do is HTTP client can return mock to-dos if you're calling this get to-dos, or mock users if you're calling get users. What we can do is we can put one condition here that if user URL is equal to users, we want to return mock users, or if URL is equal to to-dos, we will return mock to-dos, right? Now let's try to compile it. But before that, we have some compilation error because in the user service, we added a constructor. Let's take it out and clean the output and run. So we got user1, user2, user3, and task1, task2, task3. However, if you look at this HTTP client, we are using return as any, which is not very type friendly. So we will make it type friendly here. So user service should return to do array, and oh, sorry, this should be user array, and this should be to do's array. Now, if I want to take it out any here, I cannot put to do array here or user array, because if I put to do array, to do's will work, but mock user will fail. And if I put user array, so user will work and mock to do's will fail. So what should we do here? If you have seen my other video on generics, this is a use case for the generics here. So here we can say HTTP get can be of any type, and it will return that type. That means we can say this is of type T and this is of type T. And by default, if there is no matching URL, I will just return null as T. That means I can go to user service call and I can say here, this is user URL, user array being returned here, and same for get to do array. Now with that, we should get the same output with more typed approach. I click somewhere else. But now you can see we have to-dos and users and to-dos here. If you have worked with Angular, you might see this is exactly what we do when we're calling HTTP GET. We specify the type. Of course, it's observable. You need to put observable there, but this is a simplified version just to get an understanding of how it's implemented on very high level. Okay, so we have seen this issue. of dependency. Like if we put back our constructor here and we put back a property called private, retry count as number, our system will break, right? So we have got this issue. The issue is because we are creating a new instance of HTTP client. That is why it's having the issue. So in theory, what should happen is somehow we just need to get this HTTP client as a parameter when the object is created for user service. Same for the to-do service. Constructor, private, HTTP client, and empty body. Okay. And now we have another issue. When you're creating user component, here you need to pass HTTP client. Again, you're calling the new operator in user component for user service and to do for to do service. So we will have the same issue. So we should have similarly something called private, constructor when you're creating private user service of type user service, right? Same goes here. Constructor private to do service of type to do service. But now you cannot create component object now because you need to pass user service. Okay. How we can solve this one? We need a solution called dependency injection. So let's go to the diagram. What we can do? We have three classes: HTTP client, to-do service, and user service. These three classes, we do not want to create instance. We just want to use them. We want to segregate the object creation from the users. So what we can do is we need a DI container, dependency injection container, or you can call it a registry, where there should be a mapping. Like if someone just mentioned, I need a class object, I need an object for HTTP client, the caller should get object itself without worrying about his constructor. And same goes for the to-do service and user service. That means there should be a way where you specify how object should be created, and there should be a way how that object can be injected or provided to the consumer. So the first part is creating object and providing it to the DI container. When I say DI, it's a dependency injection. And second is calling the inject function, which will inject those instances to the callers. Okay, if you have worked with Angular again, you might find yourself in the similar nomenclature of the inject and provider. So we will try to implement the similar functions here, like the inject and provider and our own DI container. Okay, so on very high level, what this DI container will look like. It will be a map, a simple map in our case, where we should be able to specify the constructor type and the class type object. So let's define our own DI container here. Let's say constant providers is equal to new map. And this is our custom DI container. Then we need a function. We need a function called provide. And this function should be able to register the instance. So what we can do is we can first, actually we will just go simple here. We will directly go ahead and say providers.set, and there should be parameter called token. And if you work with Angular, you might know the concept called dependency injection token. So we will see those tokens here, like not exact token, but we will try to come up with our own syntax, our own approach of the tokens. So we will have a token which will be a constructor function. So constructor function can be defined as arguments of type any. So your constructor can take anything and it will return t. So if we are using t, that means generic, we need to define your provider should be also with generic. Okay. And now the second parameter you will need is the instance. So you need to specify for which constructor which object has to be passed. So now if I say if token is this, set its value to instance. Okay. So we will see how we will provide this value. And let's go to the bottom here. Let me comment this out for a while. And let me provide the instances now. So what I will do is provide instances. Okay, so I will just pass provide here and I will say user, not user. First I will pass HTTP client class and its instance here. And here we are passing some parameter here called retry count. So I will just pass value here HTTP. Then the next we need is a user service and to do service, which needs to be injected into user component to do component. So let me provide user service is, and its key will be new user service is instance. And are we passing any parameter there? Yeah, we are passing the parameter here to the user service. We will solve that in a second. Provide to do service, new to do service, and we need to somehow pass the HTTP client parameter here to the to do service and HTTP service. Okay, so let's do one thing. Let's comment this out and let's print our console.log providers dot entries, and let me clean the output and let's run this one. We got entries empty here. Okay, we can do another function call to get the values. Actually, we don't need to call this entries. We can directly, since it is a map, we can directly call this get method and we can pass token HTTP client. So if I just cancel this out and run this, we will get the constructor here, the HTTP constructor. Okay, so if I just uncomment this again and I say providers dot get HTTP client, again here providers dot get HTTP client, we should be able to resolve the dependency of user service and to do service. Similarly, we can use now user component and to do component with the, let me remove this, with this providers. So now I will create component here. Where is component creation class? Here is creation. So inject phase. So now I want to create a new user component instance. But now in the new user component, we have to pass user service instance. So again, I will say providers dot get and user service and let to do we have it here again. Let me copy this and let me just uncomment this one and providers dot get to do service. Now if I run this, I should get the output here. This is a very simple way of resolving the dependency injection. You can see now if you have worked with Angular version until 16, this was one of the way to inject any service. You would just have the service in the constructor. You will use here like a private to make it a member of your class, and you rely on Angular framework to provide this instance. So Angular itself maintain this kind of map and provider function, and whenever it sees the class, so in Angular you do not create your own component object here. You put a selector in an HTML, and based on that Angular create that object for you, meaning a, a component would be something like this in Angular, where there is a selector property, and it would be like app user, and you will use in HTML somewhere like app user slash app user, and this will resolve to the instance of the class, right? So Angular take cares of this one. But if you notice, we are on this TypeScript phase, and we got more or less the same output here. Very simplified way, not in the actual way of Angular does, but it shows you the how it works behind the scene. So this is our dependency injection of like providing the instance and resolving that. Now we can do something else. We can use, or we can create our own inject function here. In Angular 17, I think 14, 15 onwards, you have an inject function. What you can do, instead of providing services into a class, you can use, let me just comment this out for reference, and you can say private read only user service is equal to inject user service, something like this. And same for TodoService. Let me put here TodoService. Same I will do for HttpClient. Let me put HttpClient here, HttpClient here, oopsie, and here. Okay, so this is a new way of injecting services in Angular. So what we need a way to implement this inject function. So let's try to define our own inject function now. Let's say inject function here, and let's define function inject. So in theory, what should happen? In theory, this function should accept the token and should return instance, right? On very high level. So how it would look like in TypeScript, we can do something like t of type t, and token would be new args any which will return any type t, and that should return t. So the token is same as above, like what we defined here. Let me highlight it here so that you see when we provide, we pass this token here. So while resolving, we need the same token, and when providing, we provide the instance of type t, so we will return instead of type t here. That means what we can do is first we just check whether that instance is present. So we can say providers dot get token, and we can say if that instance is not present, then we can just throw new error, and we can say no provider found for, and I can just put a token name here, token name, and I want to use escape character here so that I can say nice result, and if it is present, I will just return it. So what we did here, we try to check our providers if there is an instance available. If it is available, we try to, if it is not available, we just throw an error and we return the instance if it is there. And again, as Angular developer, if you have tried to use a service where you did not mention it into provider section, you might have seen similar errors in the browser console like, hey, no provider is found for service XYZ. Okay. So now what we can do, we can use this service, this function here now, inject. So where was it? Here. So we already using this function. And now if I clean this one, okay, we have 5 errors now here. So instead of directly calling providers here, we can use inject function now here. Okay, sorry. Since we do not want to go with constructor approach, now our component constructor will be empty. Like we do not need this one. We can directly create instances without worrying about constructor here. And services will be taken care by the inject function. Now let's try to run it. And we have our output, nice output. Users and task. Now if you notice, this is more like typical Angular code that you have. We can improve this one more time. What we can do is we can have our own injectable decorator. So in Angular, you have something called injectable decorator on a service, and injectable, and there you pass providers or provided in, and here is a root key, or you can have different values here. Okay. What we can do, we will go simple, we will not have any object, we will just try to have our own injectable decorator. So if you have seen my other video how to create decorators, you should be familiar with the decorator syntax. Let's create decorator here. Decorator is nothing but a function, and let's say injectable of type class decorator, which will return a new constructor function called target function. And here we have reflect.define metadata, and here I will say injectable, comma true, comma target. So we are going to use this TypeScript API called reflect define metadata, and what it does is any classes where this decorator is applied, it will update its metadata by adding a property called injectable, and we are setting it true here. What does it mean? If you try to inject anything or you want to provide an instance here, right now you can provide anything in our example. You can even provide a user component, but we want to make sure only services can be injectable. So what we can do is while providing, we can add a check here whether this is something can be inject, whether this can be, whether the instance is being passed, it has this decorator function or not. So let's try to add it. So where we are here. So before setting the providers, what we can do, we can query the metadata. So we can say is injectable is equal to reflect is equal to reflect dot get metadata, and here the key I was using was injectable and the token. Okay, and here I can see if not is injectable, that means we are trying to provide a class on which injectable decorator is not provided. We want to throw error. So let me throw new error, and here I will use this syntax here that token dot name is not marked as injectable, cannot provide it. A simple message. Otherwise, we will just use the previous code to set it. Now, if we run this application, nothing should change. We should get, okay, look, this is the error I was talking about. So now we have marked user service as injectable. We have marked TodoService as injectable, but we haven't marked HttpClient as injectable. And that is why we are getting our error here that we just wrote like, hey, HttpClient is not marked as injectable, so we cannot provide it. And that is why I can fix this error by injectable decorator and clean the errors and run it. And we should have all the users and to-dos. So this is how, okay, this is not exactly how Angular implements injectable decorator. There is a way complex logic there. We are trying to implement our simplified version of injectable here just to demonstrate how does it work. Okay, so as I said, this is very important concept called dependency injection, not just in TypeScript or Angular, but it's used in C Sharp, Java, and many frameworks. So it's very important to understand the concept. Thank you.